Bill and I have been working together on a series that's a collaboration between Afikra and the NYU Arts Center in Abu Dhabi. And we are entering our second season of that collaboration. So the best way to kick off the season was a conversation with Bill. Bill, welcome to Afikra.
Thank you for having me. I've been enjoying watching you talk to our artists, and I'm happy to talk to you myself.
Yeah, so if you were to explain to somebody who didn't know about this collaboration and this podcast series, how would you best describe what we're trying to do with the second season of this series, but also the conversation series in general?
So I would say that the Arts Center itself is presenting music and dance and theater and film and spoken word and a lot of hybrid work from all around the region and all around the world. And in many cases, the artists that we're presenting are doing work that doesn't automatically fit easily into a box. They're not necessarily artists or household names. And so I think the series that we're doing with Afikra creates an opportunity to have much more in-depth conversations with the artists so that our audiences and future audiences can really understand the kinds of artists who are coming through here in Abu Dhabi, what kind of work they're making and why they're making it and what the issues are that they're making. So it's really, I think, part of our mission to just deepen the audience's understanding of art, that people are coming to and experiencing it. And I always believe that you don't need to be an expert in art to really respond to it, but there are also opportunities to go even further and even deeper, and that just enriches your understanding and your appreciation. And so that's really what I look at this collaborative project as being about.
You know, you've programmed for some of the most prestigious and well-known venues and stages in the world. I've wanted to ask you this for a while. How do you go about thinking about the curation and the programming for what happens at NYU Abu Dhabi differently than you might, think about stuff that happens at the Lincoln Center or in New York or in London or wherever?
So I think part of the job of being a curator is to respond to the specific venue and the specific context, and you're both responding to it and in a way you're shaping it, and so you're always in dialogue. And so even in New York, I went from Central Park Summer Stage as a big, large-scale free municipal festival to Joe's Pub, which was a 180-seat cabaret space downtown in East Village. Then I went back uptown to Lincoln Center. And even within New York, I think the curation that I did in each of those places had to change because the audiences in those locations changed and the physical environment changed. So when I moved to Abu Dhabi, we are on Saadiyat Island, which was just being developed at the time as the home of the Future Cultural District. So there was this real goal to expand the role of the performing arts in both the Emirate of Abu Dhabi and in the UAE as a whole and throughout the region at a startup university that is transnational, extraordinarily transnational, which is also the nature of the city. So it's unlike any audience I've ever programmed for. Our audiences come from all over the world with very different levels of experience and exposure to a lot of the work that we do. So part of it was just testing the waters and taking a chance to see what the audience would respond to, and then fixing it or addressing it and adjusting it. And then building trust, I think, was really important. Part of what we do is really work very closely with our colleagues at the university. So I am constantly scanning with my team what courses are being taught. I'm talking to a lot of faculty. What are they researching? What are the students researching? What are the conversations that are happening in the community at large, whether those are conversations about migration or about climate change and sustainability or about gender issues, or if they're just formal ideas, a certain way of making art that people have maybe not been exposed to here. And so the idea is that we are looking at the arts as a way to engage in all of those other conversations.
How familiar were you with like the UAE and Abu Dhabi and the Arabian Gulf and the Arab world before you got here?
Not very. I think in my curation previously, I'd presented a lot of works by artists, especially musical artists from the region,
Yeah.
but probably mostly from North Africa and then to some degree from the Levant, very little from the Gulf, to be quite honest. When I was approached about the opportunity here, I started doing a lot of research. I started to get very excited by what I was seeing as the plans to develop the Saadiyat Cultural District, the plans to, as the country is looking to diversify its economy, the way that the arts were really putting forward as a priority sector. And that's really rare to have the sort of weight of a nation really kind of say that arts are important coming from the US, where often people working in the performing arts feel like we're under attack the whole time. It was
Mm-hmm.
really refreshing, and it was a very special opportunity. And I think part of the opportunity was the opportunity to learn in a place that I hadn't been before, where I could go in with a sort of beginner's mind and then make connections and try to find people who could lead me along and help me to understand it. And the longer I'm here, I think the deeper my understanding gets. There are things that I can do now that I wasn't able to do when I first got here, and that will continue to evolve. And at the same time, the place has evolved around me. So when I got here, there was no Louvre Abu Dhabi. It was an idea, but it hadn't opened yet. There are other cultural centers that have opened since we've been here. We're all in dialogue. So it's also a very dynamic ecosystem. And so it's
Mm-hmm.
also the Abu Dhabi that I'm programming in right now is different from the one that I came to 9 years ago.
Yeah. So the first time I actually came to see a show, even though we've been working together for a while, you like very frantically walked me around. And you're like, I got to show you all the different spaces, which I appreciated tremendously.
Yeah.
But let's do sort of a podcasty tour of these spaces. So when you think of the Art Center, what constitutes that center physically?
So physically, we are in a building that is both an academic building and a public programming building. So the Arts Center, conceptually, when I speak about it, I'm often talking about the program of public programs, but it's also the physical space that houses the arts practice classes. So within the university, they teach music, film and new media, interactive media, theater, and visual arts. I think it's interesting. It's a liberal arts college, and the idea that all of those different disciplines are all in the same building and the students are working across a lot of those different forms, I think informs it. So this is a learning space. It's also a maker space. So the back of the building has all of the studios, recording studios, sound stages for film, theater rehearsal studios, 2D and 3D art studios. So it's also a maker place. It's a learning place. It's an administering place, and then it's public programming. And so in the front part of the building, there are 3 venues that are used for performance. The one that you have on screen right now is the Red Theater. That's our largest theater. It really was a game changer in the UAE when it opened. It's 685 seats, proscenium fly house. I think as people can see, it's a really beautiful venue. The scale, this has a little bit of a weird lens on it. It's a little bit of a fisheye lens. It's got incredible sight lines. You walk in and you feel a sense of grandeur, but you also feel a sense of intimacy. And there's a great relationship between the stage and the audience. Artists really love playing there. And it is the kind of venue that didn't exist in the country before we opened, of a purpose-built quality. Right after we opened, Dubai Opera opened in Dubai. And so I think the two of us together really changed the game. So that is one. The first venue to open was the Black Box. I don't know if you've got a photo of that to pull up, but that's the Black Box from above. It is an open venue that is really flexible. So right now we've got an installation in it with about 4,000 reactive lights hanging down, and the audience sort of explores the space. Sometimes we set it head on with stadium seating in more of a traditional theater form. We do stand-up rock shows. We do processional shows. So that one is the one that's most flexible and adaptable to the specific needs. And then we have the Blue Hall, which was built as a recital hall. It's 150 seats, gorgeous, it's, really beautiful blonde wood, incredible acoustics, and that's most suitable for acoustic music. We also have a film series, Cinema Na, contemporary Arab cinema, that's presented there. all of the spaces are used to develop work. All of the spaces are used to present work. So they're all multifunction. And so there are different sizes, different scales, different physical environments that then lend a different element to the performances themselves.
Okay, so cool. Let's talk a little bit about the book, which is sort of, it's a box set. It's more than a book. What was the idea? What was the conceit of this project? Why did it lend itself to that sort of medium? And walk us through it.
So the book, I still file away every email in relation to it. Under in a folder that's entitled Art Center 5th Anniversary Book. We're about to begin our 9th year, right? There was a pandemic in the middle and things take a long time. But I think part of it has to do with this idea of why we started as part of this really historic transformation of the UAE and the building of a cultural district on Saadiyat Island. We're not officially in the cultural district. We're sort of one exit over in the marine district, but we're very much part of that same impulse. And I think we really wanted, from the beginning, we've made a point to build the archive as we're doing it. I think we realize that there is historical importance here that will be important in the legacy of the country. We film every performance that we present, so we've got an incredible video archive, which really came in handy during the pandemic. We've got a great photographic archive. And so it started, I think, thinking that, we should do a photo exhibition of all these beautiful photos, many of them by Walid Shah. And so I think we wanted to create a coffee table book, but we also wanted to create documentation in near real time that could leave breadcrumbs for future historians. We wanted to recognize that the Art Center means many things and many different things to many different people. So we didn't want to have a single authoritative author. We wanted to have a collection of voices. I think I refer to it in the description as a polyphony of voices. So I think that idea that we're reflecting the large community of people that we serve, artists and critics and students and faculty and staff, and all of those voices are reflected in the book. And the conceit of the box set, we for a long time, when we were creating printed materials to promote the show, after the first season, we started going to the square and roughly album size, and then CD size for the smaller handouts. And so I think the music metaphor was interesting. So the box set for this was interesting. And working with our editor, Nadine Khalil, who's an art critic who's very present, and a curator who's very present, we came up with this sort of conceptual idea of using the venues that we just spoke about as a way to get at our history. So we start with the East Plaza, which is the main fourth venue that we use, which is the plaza right in front of the Art Center. And when I got here, the venues weren't ready, right? Construction takes time, and so the university opened, but there was still work that needed to be done on the venues. But in my history, I had presented a lot of work outside at Central Park Summer Stage, at Lincoln Center. And so my feeling was, we don't need to let that stop us. We'll put a stage up and we'll do work on the plaza. And because the university for the first 4 years had been downtown in central Abu Dhabi and then moved to this island that was very underpopulated, the campus was probably about a quarter of the population that it is now. I think there were 800 students when I got here as compared to 2,200. We found that doing something outdoors on the plaza really gave a center and really brought people together. And the creative placemaking is one of the concepts that gets talked about a lot in the arts, and community building is a big interest of mine. And we realized that the East Plaza was the place where we were gathering our creative community. So the first chapter in the book is sort of our origin story, and that is the East Plaza. It's about creating a space. It's about creating a place that would be a magnet for people from the city who weren't used to coming to Saadiyat because it had not been occupied. It wasn't on people's mental map. And so even those arrows, right? That is, how do we get people to come to NYU Abu Dhabi on Saadiyat? And so that's what the first book is about. The second volume is the black box, and the black box with that flexible layout I was discussing is also the most experimental space. I talk about it as a laboratory for performance. It's a place where a lot of work is devised and created, including a lot of student work. And so that was the sort of our first full season where once we got indoors, we were really experimenting with who we were as a performing arts center. What did we mean to people? And so that's what the second volume is. The third volume, The Red Theater, is the coming of age.
Before you
And
go on to
that,
the third
yeah.
volume,
Okay. Yep.
when you talk about the black box, I would imagine that's not only a place for experimentation as producers and performers, but also an experimentation for audience members, because that's not a traditional venue, I think, in the Arab world. That idea of, this like these like there's like this cube basically that you walk into and it looks different every single time and it's completely a blank canvas. I'm curious how audiences have responded to shows in the black box in a way that's maybe different than the Red Theater and more traditional theaters that people think of in their mind's eye.
Well, I think what's interesting is I don't know if I could separate the architecture from the work. So the nature of the work that we put into that space is also by definition often going to be less traditional. We've also had chamber music concerts in there and Arabic music and jazz concerts and straightforward musical kind of EDM shows and dance shows. But we did, especially in the first season, we were learning the venue and we wanted to figure out what is the best configuration for it. So every time we did a show, Chris Pye, our director of production, would sort of draw up a different map and we'd put the stage in a different place, and we were just really also like testing out what we could do and how did the audience experience. And we've had different journeys of how the audience enters a space, how they leave, what the seating is like. But oftentimes now we also default to it's head on, it's 165 seats, it's stadium seating, and it can be a very familiar kind of venue as well. But then we've got the flexibility, we can take everything out. We have a few lifts where we can change the levels in there, and scenic designers I think really respond to the openness and opportunity there.
Cool. Okay, sorry, I took you off track. Let's talk about the third book, the red book, the
Red Theater. So the Red Theater, as you saw, it's a spectacularly beautiful theater. I talk about it as a game changer. And so this chapter is really about the coming of age, and we're now working with artists at a scale that we hadn't been able to do in the black box, with sort of a size and scope. It opened in the middle of our second full season, and so then we had started to invest in commissioning new works, and so it's a place where we had a lot of world premieres. But also right now you've got on screen Lucinda Child's Dance, which is an iconic piece from the late 70s, music by Philip Glass. Saul LeWitt did the films that are being seen in it. It had been revived for about 10 years, and these were the last performances before they retired the piece again. So really the idea is like this is a place to do some monumental work and really significant work. And so that is the sort of landmark chapter. The next chapter, the Blue Hall, is the site of a lot of our collaborations with our academic colleagues. So that's where faculty and student recitals take place, a film series that's curated by a faculty member, Skander Kopti. And so that chapter gave us a chance to really talk about what it means for us to be a performing arts center that is also part of a university and is really reinforcing the educational mission. And then the last chapter, the last volume, is Beyond the Borders. And that, because we didn't get it done in time for our 5th anniversary, then we wanted to talk about what did we do during the pandemic. And if the first chapter is about the struggles of how do you get people to come to a place and build a community that is in a site that people hadn't come to before, the challenge when the pandemic started was, what does it mean to be a performing arts center when you can't actually physically gather in person? And that's when we started exploring, even in a series like this,
Yeah.
kind of what is the role and how can we expand our reach using new media, using even more experimental forms. And we had a number of pieces that were really creatively exciting and challenging and opened up definitions and pushed the way that we thought about what was important in our work. And so that last chapter gives us a chance to really dig into a few of those projects in particular that feel like signature projects. And now, of course, we're back to in person primarily. And so also even something like this, what did we learn during the pandemic? What do we want to hold on to? What were the advantages of that? And being able to continue to connect to audiences internationally, I think was one of those real discoveries.
I'm curious, how has the relationship with artists changed, international artists changed over the last 9 years? I mean, 9 years ago, you send a email to artists you know or you don't know saying, "Hey, come to Abu Dhabi." The response is different than if you email them now, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, when I first started, we had no track record. People didn't know people. A lot of the early bookings, especially, were artists and managers and agents who I had a long relationship with.
Yeah.
And so there was definitely this sense of trust. Like, all right, Bill Bragin left New York, where he's working in all these places, left Lincoln Center to go to this place. What was that about? Like, why would he do that? And they was like, all right, if he made that move, like, let's go check out what it is, right? And we've made a point. We've got an incredible team here. We take very good care of artists. We present their work really well. It's a community that's unlike anywhere else in the world that any of these artists have performed before. And when they're here, we're really integrating them not just in the performance, but we're having meals with community members and they're in the classrooms with the university and they're giving workshops and talks. And the goal is to really have the artists come away with a sense of connectedness to us.
Hmm.
And so we've had a lot of artists come back and come back multiple times because they realize that there's something special happening here. And I think in the presenting world, there's a feedback loop that happens that first you develop a good relationship with an artist and present their work well and treat them well, and they want to work together again. And they also tell other people. And then we've built a body of work over time that then people we don't know have now heard about what we do and they want to be a part of it. And so I think the circle then expands that way. And it's always a balance of when do we work with the same artist again on a new project and how do we make sure that we're constantly creating space for people we haven't worked with before.
What does that do to the student culture, like over 9 years? How's the sort of student life changed as a product of that amount of cultural production?
Well, I think what's interesting is many of our students, they come from about 120 different countries, and many of them are coming where this kind of performing arts was just not part of their upbringing at all. So for a lot, this is just like a life-changing light bulb being turned on quite regularly. And with artists at the level that in other cities and other places, the artist would be completely inaccessible. The ticket prices would be inaccessible. The artist personally would be inaccessible. But here, all of our students get free tickets to all of our shows. The artists are showing up in their class. They can take workshops with them. They can learn directly from them. They can make plans for coffee. We had an intern who worked with us who was a theater and music major. And I think it was in our first season, we had Kronos Quartet here.
Wow.
David Harrington, the founder of Kronos Quartet, is extraordinarily open and curious and engaging. And they ran into each other walking around campus on the way to breakfast and decided to have breakfast together. And then one of our students ended up sitting with David Harrington from Kronos talking about his senior recital and what repertoire he might perform. And then they started trading music tips. Like, you don't get that.
Yeah.
when Sam Green was here developing 32 Sounds, which is still currently touring. It's an experimental documentary featuring live performance. He was developing the film during the pandemic, and so we actually put together a group of students who met with him once a month as he was filming and as he was struggling with how does he continue to actually make his work during the lockdown. And so the access to the process was also really important. And I think now we have students who started coming to the Art Center on high school field trips and then decided they wanted to apply to Abu Dhabi, NYU Abu Dhabi, and we even have students who've already graduated and are out in the world working as artists in the UAE, working as arts administrators at a lot of the other cultural institutions around the country because they've had this experience here. So it is really about the way that we're building a sector and exposing the artists who are students here to different modes of art making that they might previously not have considered. So I really think about it as a sort of expansion of the vocabulary. And then they in turn have more tools to tell more personal, more local stories.
Very, very cool. I want to go back to the first question about curation.
Yeah.
And let's sort of center it in this season, this upcoming season.
Great.
What was the approach to curating this season? And maybe we could talk about some of the acts that are going to be coming and maybe talk about some of them that are going to be featured on this series as well.
Mm-hmm. So in general, there are many different theories and approaches to curation. Mine is fairly personal. We have a very generic name in a way, the Art Center at NYU Abu Dhabi. But I think my approach, I stand on stage at the beginning of every show and introduce the show. In the lobby afterwards. I think for me, the idea is that we're not an anonymous institution. I'm a person with tastes and interests, and I work with other people who all have their own tastes and interests. And so I think what we're presenting is quirky and eclectic, and I think reflects my own sensibilities and my own conversation with the place I'm living and working. And I often try not to, and I don't think of myself as an expert in anything. Okay? I think of myself as an enthusiast and as somebody who wants to share my enthusiasms with other people. My social media profile is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, and it's imposing his taste on friends and strangers since 19 whatever. And so ultimately I come from the standpoint of when you look at the season, it's a collection of artists and projects that got me excited and I wanted to share it. And that, I think, for me is the sort of fundamental ethos. And then it's also doing that with a team of collaborators and, again, looking at how it fits into these broader conversations. I don't usually have a single theme for the season, but this year the UAE is hosting COP28. The country has a theme for each year. This year is the theme of sustainability. So there was a particular challenge of how can I take this sort of eclectic personal approach and thread the issues around climate, environment, sustainability through the season. And I think one of the reasons it's a good theme is that there are so many different sub themes that work within that, and then it helps to formulate what artists and what projects get greenlit. I think there's almost an infinite number of shows that could be in our season, and so the question of why this show and why now? And so I do think this thread of climate sustainability gave it a little bit of a form, but then there's also issues of personal passion and connection and artists that speak to other issues of concern in the UAE.
Do you have a sense of what you hope the Art Center looks like when it's celebrating its 25th anniversary?
I guess I do think in terms of institution building, right? And I remember the week that I moved here in December 2014, there was an article in the New York Times that was about the plans to develop the Guggenheim, Abu Dhabi.
Mm-hmm.
And it made reference to a kind of cynical approach, this idea of, oh, the UAE is just importing name brands. Zaki Nusseibeh, His Excellency, who was present working side by side with His Highness Sheikh Zayed during the founding of the country, has been one of the leading cultural figures throughout the entire history of the country, was quoted in that article as saying that we are lucky that we've got the sort of resources and the ability to sort of jumpstart it. But ultimately, and now I'm just paraphrasing, it's an intergenerational strategy. And imagine what it means when kids who are growing up here or adults have had these institutions their entire lives. And that is really, I think that was so influential in kind of thinking about the impact of what we do. And there is the epiphanies that happen every week when we've got a show in the theater, but also the cumulative effect of like, what is the impact on a culture in 25 years where you've had this extraordinary performing arts center bringing artists from everywhere in traditional and non-traditional forms. And that kind of expansiveness is just part of the ethos of the place, and everybody has access to it. So that, I think, thinking about that long-term vision and the permanence again, and this book as a document of what did it look like in the beginning and what was on our mind now, I think is actually important. And so this is. I think I use the phrase, or I often use the phrase about leaving breadcrumbs for future historians. I think that's really the goal, because I think I think what's happening here is quite special.
Okay, amazing. I'm gonna, as you've been imposing your taste on your friends and family since 19 blank blank blank, I want you to impose your taste on our listeners and viewers. If I were to ask you to put together your playlist, your mixtape, what goes on your mixtape? What are the performers or performances that you're like, stop what you're doing, go to YouTube, look up these, let's say 5 performances, whether they've graced the Art Center stages or not. What are the first 5 that come to mind when you think about recommendations?
I have so many different versions of this, depending on what the narrative is. There's a 17-year-old blogger and podcaster who asked me to create an autobiographical playlist for her podcast. And I went back to like my first 45, which was Steve Miller's The Joker, my first concert, which was Kiss. And I gave her the sort of suburban New York kind of early rock person.
Yeah.
For this, I will say this season contains one of my bucket list projects that is very much part of my personal narrative about why I do what I do. So if you scroll up, in October, we're presenting the Philip Glass Ensemble doing Chiana live.
Cool.
And when I was in high school, I heard Chiana on a new music radio show, and it blew my mind open. I'd never heard music like that. I fell in love with it. About a year and a half later, I found out that there was going to be a screening of the film that it's based on at an art house cinema in Manhattan. I was living in the suburbs on Long Island near JFK Airport. None of my friends wanted to go, and I went to the city by myself to see this film. And again, it was one of those experiences that literally changed the way that I see the world. And so to have that in my season now finally is really personally important, and I think it will hopefully do the same for others. So
Amazing.
Chiana always. I had a long conversation with a faculty friend last night about Chico Science and Nassau Zumbi. Chico Science was he's passed away now. The band still continues. He was the leader of a musical movement from the northeast of Brazil that emerged in the early mid-90s called Mangue Beat. Mangue as a reference to the mangroves that his city was built on, and beat, originally BIT, like computer bits that became beat like a musical beat. And the general sort of ethos of this musical movement is that You've got crabs who are crawling around, scavengers in the mud, that are also connected through satellite dishes to the rest of the universe. And so it was this idea of hyper global and hyper local coexisting. And they're artists that were mixing traditional music from the northeast of Brazil, coco, maracatu, ciranda, embolada, with speed metal and hip hop and punk and eventually jungle and drum and bass. And so when I got that as a musical movement was really influential to me. And so I think when I got here, that interest in sort of cultural hybridity has very much been a through line in a lot of the work that I do in the Barsac Festival, but also in a group like Asian Dub Foundation, who, in their own way, in their own context, are coming from very, very parallel impulses at a very similar historical time. So Chico Science and Nelson Zumbi, Elvis Costello, I had a Elvis Costello centerpiece at my bar mitzvah. So Elvis is always there. David Bowie is always there. I think both of them were shapeshifters in all kinds of ways. So those are always on my mixtapes. And then like any number of 1,000 other people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you remember that movie? I think it was late '90s, early 2000s. High Fidelity.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah. Do you remember that moment where he's like reorganizing his records, and Jack Black comes in and is like, "Are you doing this alphabetically?" And he's like, "No, I'm doing it biographically."
Yeah, which is an amazing way to do it. Alphabetically is easier to find things sometimes because your biography shifts, your interpretation does. I always opt for the first letter of the first word.
Yeah.
Because it's always like, does Elvis Costello go under E or C, and what about Snoop Dogg? So it's
Exactly.
yeah, so yeah.
Or then it becomes tricky when it's like A Tribe Called Quest. Is it A or is it T?
Oh, you drop the article. Yeah, you drop
Okay.
the los, you drop you drop the A.
Okay, good.
I thought a lot about this because in certain ways, I am that geek. And especially High Fidelity was John Cusack, right?
Yeah.
And ever since, like, Say Anything, my high school girlfriend was like, I just saw this movie. There was this guy who kind of looks like you, reminds me of you. So John Cusack has always been like following me throughout my life.
Yeah. Okay, I want to wrap up with a quick Q&A. But maybe before we wrap up, maybe we can mention some of the folks who might be on the series this year.
Yeah.
And so you already mentioned Asian Dub Foundation. But are there any other names that jump out that you're like, ooh, this on the series, that may or may not be on the series this year? Always, there's always schedule issues that come about, but might be worth mentioning some of them so people can look them up.
Well, I would actually start with what's on screen right now, because the Now Is When We Are, Andrew Schneider, is part of a series of pieces that we've been presenting over the years. We've been focusing in part on micro theater and on artists who are really kind of pushing the bounds of what is theater? Is this theater? Is this an installation? What is it? I've never seen anything like it. I don't know how to describe it. Some of my favorite programming, a lot of my favorite programming is the programming that's the hardest to explain what it is. And we came up with our slogan, which is "Come Curious, Leave Inspired," in part because that's our bargain with the audience. We want to build a relationship where people read the description and they're like, "What is this? I don't know what it is." But they haven't steered me wrong. I'll try it. I'll test it. And this is, I think, a great example. Andrew is a theater maker who does very intricate lighting and sound design that deals with magic and the magic of technology, but then it goes away and it's got a great heart. There are 4,000 LED lights, reactive lights, and about 500 speakers that are arrayed around the space. It's in our black box. It's completely pitch black, and only 8 people at a time go through it. And there's a series of recorded monologues, and the voices follow the audience as they're in their journey. The lights are responding to them. And in many ways, it's a meditation on time and what are humans like, what's your place in the cosmos and how do you build your life. I think in many ways it was developed during the pandemic, and the text sort of captures that moment. It's technologically spectacular. It's visually and sonically spectacular, but also it's really emotionally moving. And when people walk out of there, we have these long conversations with people in the lobby. And that, again, that idea that this art is in a form that nobody's seen before. They understand as soon as they're in it, they understand it. They understand their version of it, and then it lands in a different way. So that we have 54 performances in about a 10-day period. They sold out in advance. Again, this trust factor is incredible. And to use that as an opening statement for our season, I think was really important, that we still want our audiences to come with this sense of the unknown. And it also sets the theme for the environmental conversation. When I asked him if there was a climate lens to the piece, he talked about the overview effect when the astronauts first went to space and saw the Earth from above, and that iconic photo of the big blue marble that literally changed people's worldviews. It became the cover of the Whole Earth catalog, and that was really the birth of the modern ecology movement. And so, in a way, this piece is also like this is the opening salvo in a season of work around sustainability.
Cool.
Betside Machado is almost the opposite, and it's our second season opener. It's big and celebratory. It's an Afro-Venezuelan group from a very small town in Venezuela that we tried to bring. We were planning to bring her right at the beginning of the pandemic and weren't able to. And so we've been working on it for about 3 years. We commissioned during the pandemic. They created a documentary that was looking at traditional women's music from Venezuela. And aired that documentary online. But the team has actually just arrived about an hour ago. And so this is really about 3.5 years worth of patience. And they're on a bill with the Liwa Maritime Ensemble, which is a traditional Emirati group. And so again, part of the idea is to connect this music of the Americas with music from the Gulf, both with different links to the African continent. And so again, one of the issues that is constantly in conversation in the UAE is a question of heritage. And so this idea of a group that's very traditional but puts it together in a very smart way, I think, how do you preserve cultural heritage but then kind of connect it with global audiences? That's what this show is about. So again, all of I can get into that level of my sort of personal justification for every show in the season, and I do it to people around me all the time. But I think that's a really good place to stop.
That's great. Let's wrap up with a quick Q&A, and then
I'm always afraid of this part, by the way.
Yeah. Well, let's lean into the fear.
Okay, lean into the fear.
What are you reading or watching these days?
So the other night I just watched the new Adam Sandler movie.
I heard it's excellent.
It's really good. You Are So Not Invited to My Bat Mitzvah. It was really funny and really true, and spoke to my kind of suburban New York Jewish upbringing. I'm reading Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown. She's someone I encountered through Toshi Regan, whose Parable of the Sower is a big part of the origin story of the Art Center. And that was based on Octavia Butler's novel. And Adrienne Marie Brown and Toshi Regan had a podcast that they started doing during the pandemic called Octavia's Parables. And so I just started hearing about emergent strategies, and it really has to do with both kind of creative and organizing techniques, and the way that you kind of create through small systems. You can create extraordinary complexity and change by really addressing things on the most local level. So that's what I'm reading right now.
Awesome. Who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
Wow. In a way, I've been walking in his footsteps in different ways. Joseph Papp, who founded Shakespeare in the Free Shakespeare in the Park and the Public Theater. So I work very much in his legacy, but he had passed away before I ever worked there. I never had a chance to meet him. But I feel like the work I do is so informed by his belief that theater and the arts should be as free and available to people as books are in the library. And that the idea of sort of you can push an art form forward by also removing the barriers, especially financial barriers. And so, yeah, I would love to have a chance to actually kind of, because I've worked in his building and I ran the club that bears his name, but I never met him. I think probably Joseph Papp.
Cool. What do you think people most misunderstand about your work?
I think sometimes people think my work is experimental, and I think I am definitely a quirky, idiosyncratic curator, but I'm also a populist, and I believe that actually most people have access to really enjoy and appreciate and get a lot from the work that I do, even if when they read the description it makes absolutely no sense. I'm not an avant-gardist. I'm actually, I think at my core, I'm a populist. I just have a very expansive belief that people's capacity is very large.
Yeah. I mean, generally, I feel like in my interaction with you, I could see where that misunderstanding comes from for sure. But generally, in my interaction with you, you want people to enjoy the show, right? You're like, this is like, come on, this is, you don't want people to sort of like walk out and be confused and sort of, that's generally my sense with you.
Yeah. And I'm also not afraid of people leaving confused, and I think that's okay, right? And that's the other thing. I think what I don't want is if people walk out and they're confused, I don't want them to walk out and think that that was their failing, that they are somehow not educated enough, or they have like that. If they're confused, maybe the artist actually left it open and confusion was the intended effect.
Correct.
I want them thinking about it, and I want them feeling something or thinking something. I don't want them to necessarily be able to like articulate everything and articulate it perfectly, but I think it is the way that the arts can often be obscured, and that's I want to demystify contemporary dance, jazz, experimental electronic music, all of that. I think people have access to if you provide A, the access, and B, some tools or a place to have a conversation afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. It's my general sense is that you don't have like an antagonistic relationship with the audience.
No, I'm not here to shock them, but I am here to kind of like give them an experience that they haven't had before, right? Somebody once referred to novelty in relation to my work. And at first I was like, novelty, that sounds really light, but novelty from the standpoint of a new experience that you haven't had before, I'm like, yeah, okay, I buy that. That makes sense. Sure. Yeah.
And the last one is, outside of your profession, whose work do you admire and are inspired by?
Outside, I'm so sucked up in my profession, and I think of my profession so expansively. I don't feel like I don't want to go outside my profession, actually.
I love that answer. What a great answer.
because my profession is everything. Like Toshi Regan, I am always in awe of Toshi. Every time I have a conversation with her, I learn something, and I learn something not just about art, but around community, around activism, around how do you create change, around how do you create inspiration, how do you transform an institution. So I don't feel like I don't want to separate the arts from the rest of the world. So that might be a cop out, but
no, that's not a cop out. That's a great answer. That's a fantastic answer. So everyone listening, subscribe to two things. One, please subscribe to the NYU Arts Center podcast, which we are doing in collaboration. This episode is on the Afikra podcast as well as that feed, but go subscribe to that feed on Apple, on Spotify, and Rami, Google Podcasts, everywhere. You can see the first season, all the episodes that we released first season, and then you will get all of the second season there too. And you can find out more about the Art Center on all social media platforms at NYUAD Arts Center. Bill, thanks so much for being a part of the series, and I am thrilled that we're doing season 2 together.
I am too, and thank you for the great conversation. I always love watching the conversations we have with other people, and I'm very happy that we could have one too.
Me too.